and welcome to another episode of InFocus, presented by Hood College Broadcasting. I'm your host, Tim Sylvia, and today we are joined by Tom Hall of WYPR. YPR, I got that right?
You did.
He is the host of Midday, which is conveniently the title of the show and when it airs. It airs on WYPR every midday from noon to 1. So Tom, nice to have you on InFocus.
Good to see you, Tim. Thank you.
So you're here today because you just finished wrapping up taping a segment of Midday here at Hood College. So could you tell me a little bit about how that came to be, where this whole plan just kind of came from?
Well, we are, of course, the NPR affiliate in Baltimore, but we want to cover the whole state of Maryland. So certainly our signal goes out to the Eastern Shore, to Western Maryland, and throughout Central Maryland. So we do a lot of stories that are Baltimore focused, but we also want to do stories that are Frederick focused. So today our focus was Frederick at the crossroads, because there's a really interesting dichotomy between development and economic growth and population growth and people who like it the way it was in the old days. You know, the people who are not willing to give up the rural character of the area. So we thought that was a good story. We thought that was something that needed to be explored a little bit. So we were delighted to come down here to Hood and have several panelists talk about that, both how the college fits into that scenario. We had the mayor of Frederick, we had the county executive of Frederick County. We talked about this tension between the development side and the maintaining the rural character of the area.
Right, because anyone who comes to Frederick can see how kind of a juxtaposed area it is when it comes to, you're driving through farmland and then all of a sudden you're in this more developed kind of up-and-coming urban center.
Yeah, and it's a dilemma that a lot of cities face, cities both large and small. So Frederick, the growth here in Frederick and Frederick County, it's the fifth fastest growing jurisdiction in the state. So it's, in that top 5 group, there's some 70% population growth in the last 25 years. That's huge. Yeah. And so that puts a stress on the school system. It puts a stress on transportation infrastructure. It puts a stress on police. It puts a stress on a number of county and city services. So how do you balance that, those two competing notions and keep everybody happy?
Right, and I guess the most natural follow-up to what we just said, show went well today?
Yeah, we had a good time. We broadcast live. This is the 3rd time that we've done a show from a remote location. We did one at the Parkway Theater in Maryland, which is the new home of the Maryland Film Festival. We did one at the Baltimore Museum of Industry, where we talked about the future of work and the labor force and the changing dynamics in the labor force. And then today, as I said, we're talking about Frederick at the crossroads and the various tensions that exist here. So we had a good time. We're going to be doing another remote broadcast in Chestertown this summer. And then in the fall, we're going to be broadcasting from one of the brand new public schools that's being built by the state for the city of Baltimore.
Mm-hmm. Now, you release Midday as a radio show, but as I also said, on a podcast that appears on iTunes and... Well, I know iTunes.
Yeah.
So how do you feel that the rise of podcasting that we've seen in the last couple of years is going to change journalistic radio?
Well, I'm not sure it's going to change the product, the way we put the product together. What may change is the way we package it. It used to be that, you did your radio show and then you put it up there as a podcast, and that's in fact how we do it at Midday, only because we are concentrating on the fact that we're a radio show first and a podcast second. However, at WYPR, we now have a whole menu of podcasts that are made as podcasts. That's a different animal. And journalists and creators are finding that it's a different endeavor to make a podcast than it is to make a radio program. Now, we're glad to have our radio program available as a podcast, because if you can't tune in at noon for whatever reason, you just hit the app on your phone or on your iPad or on your computer, and you can hear it anytime. We're doing a whole series, for example, of conversations with candidates, people who are running for public office throughout the state, congressional level, the county executive level, even in the state legislature. So, if you haven't been able to hear interviews with particular candidates and you're thinking about voting for them or for their opponent, you can tune into the podcast anytime and get to hear in their own words where they stand on various issues. So our show is still primarily a radio show that is also podcast, but I do think it's a really exciting era for journalism and for storytelling, that people can make now podcasts that are specifically for people who are tuning in to that subject, and that's the difference. Of course, we broadcast, or when you say broadcast, it is in fact broad. We put it out there, and whoever wants can tune in. A podcast, your audience tends to be a little bit more specific, because if you're doing one on sports, or if you're doing one on fashion, or if you're doing one on politics, or one on music, you have people who are interested in those things specifically finding you at the time that is convenient for them and then tuning in. So I think it's a great opportunity for both consumers of stories and creators of stories.
Right. So do you think that you will, or how do you think we'll see a bit of a journalistic revolution in terms of podcasting, where you can get this sort of medium that not only has more of a continuity than a radio show can provide, but also kind of opens up a not really so much seen world of long-form journalism and broadcasting?
I mean, the thing about a podcast is you can make it as long as you'd like, and I'm very much, a slave to the clock. I have to start at noon, I have to be out exactly at 1 o'clock, and we have to have news breaks in between, so or breaks to identify sponsors and underwriters. But one of the exciting things about podcasts is that there are people who can have creative control from the very beginning to the end of the process, and many times it's just one person or a team of one or two people. It's not a large team, so there's a lot of creative leeway, there's a lot of creative license going into that, and that can be a very exciting thing. So radio tends to be a little bit more complicated. There's some there's a lot of different constituencies that have to be answered to. Podcasts, not so much. I mean, you put a product out there that if it's exciting, if it's compelling, if it's interesting, if it's timely, you're going to get an audience. And as we've seen, there are any number of podcasts that are doing financially very well because they are delivering an audience of interested, engaged, compelled listeners and viewers. So it's an exciting time.
Mm-hmm. And to stray from that topic a little bit for our last super serious question, so your background isn't necessarily traditionally in journalism. I know that you come from a background of the choral arts, and you were the director of music for the Baltimore Choral Arts Society up until 2017. So how does that sort of non-traditional background, have you seen it help or maybe hinder you in your career?
Well, I've always been a political junkie. So even when I was a full-time professional musician, I was paying attention to politics, paying attention to what was going on around us in our world. And I was a performer. I did concerts constantly. I did sometimes 70, 80 concerts a year. So I was in front of audiences all of the time. What's interesting is that I started doing the radio show part-time about 15 years ago, and then I was doing music really kind of full-time and reporting particularly on cultural events. That's how I started at WYPR. I hosted a show about music, and then I reported on arts and culture scene in Baltimore and throughout the state. And then basically just the balance shifted. So after a while, it was determined that it would work out best for all involved for me to do the radio full-time and music part-time. So now I'm doing music very part-time. I mean, I'm freelancing every so often and doing some concerts, but I'm very blessed. I had a career of 40-some years as a professional performing musician, and now in this particular political moment, in this particular historical moment, which I think is a really crucial pivot point for our country and for our world, it's very exciting, and I feel very lucky and honored to have a platform where we can talk about the issues that really matter to a lot of people.
All right, and so your show is only an hour, and you talk about how much, the political climate as it exists today. How do you find that you're best able to get everything you want to say in, because you don't have that full hour, like you said, there's times where you have to dedicate to ads or whatever. How do you find you're able to best get the information across concisely but also powerfully?
Well, part of what we do is we think both in the long term and the large 30,000-foot view, as well as the minutia of a particular segment. What are we going to try to accomplish in this 15 minutes? What are we going to try to accomplish in this 12 minutes with such and such a guest? But more broadly, we also think about our story selection in terms of what have we covered over the week, what have we covered over the month, what have we covered over the course of the year. Who are the voices that we are bringing to bear to talk about the issues that matter to people? Do we have people of color? Do we have women? Do we have older people, younger people? Do we have voices that come from different segments of our society, different segments of our listening audience, to comment about these issues that affect everybody? So I think the kinds of voices that we put on and the commitment to have diverse voices, the commitment to have people who are not always maybe the first person you would think of. It's not always the scholar. It's not always the journalist who's writing about a particular issue. Perhaps it's somebody who is involved in the issue in a different way, either as an activist or as an organizer or as a person whose perspective is not the kind of perspective that you get in the print media or on television. So we're trying to have a diverse group of voices, and we're trying to make sure that we bring as many of those voices to bear over a long period of time. In terms of how we manage the show each day, some days it works out better than others. Some days the guests that you bring, have things to say that you didn't expect and that are pretty revelatory, and other times not so much. I mean, it's like any job. You have good days and bad days. But I think, as I say, over the course of 6 months, over the course of a year, if you're tuning into Midday, you're hearing about a number of different topics. You're hearing about a number of different issues, and you're hearing about those issues from a number of different people. So I think the diversity, the difference, the mix of stories and people to comment on the stories is really what we are, that's our first and foremost most important job.
Right. I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us here on InFocus. That's it. That's what we have with Mr. Tom Hall. So again, I'd like to thank you one more time for joining us.
Thank you.
You can catch his show every weekday from 12 to 1 on WYPR. One more time, it's called Midday. Tom, thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Tim.
For InFocus, I've been Tim Sylvia, and will continue to be Tim Sylvia.